Everybody. Welcome to the NDI Checkpoint 2017 Proxy Season Preview. We're going to give everybody about another minute to dial in, and then we will begin some of the housekeeping slides for today's presentation. Thank you. Great. So let's begin. We can move on into our presentation with a few housekeeping slides. Go ahead and switch that over in our live view. Great. So questions can be entered via the Q&A widget, which is at the bottom of your screen in the little banner. If you would like, you can have questions answered individually. If you experience any technical difficulties during the presentation, you can visit the webcast help guide by clicking the help button at the bottom of the presentation window, which is designated with a question mark icon. The PowerPoint presentation will be available on our website at Foley.com in the next few days, or you can get a copy of the slides in the resource list widget at the bottom, which is available for download. Foley will apply for CLE credit after the program. To be eligible for CLE, you will need to log into the On24 session and answer a polling question during the program. If you do not supply your CLE information upon registration, please email it to hpapadakis@foley.com. Please note certificates of attendance will be distributed to eligible participants approximately 8 weeks after the web conference via email. Please note that those seeking Kansas, New York, and New Jersey CLE credit are required to complete the attorney affirmation form in addition to answering the polling question that will appear during the program. A 5-digit code will be announced during the presentation. Email the code and the form to hpapadakis@foley.com immediately following the program. And the attorney affirmation form was provided during the initial registration process, so that should be available. I will now pass it on to our first speaker.
Thanks, Harrison. Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning to some of you. My name is Kirk Creeley, and I'm a partner with the Transactional and Securities Group of Foley and Lardner. Welcome to today's presentation. And before we get started, I'd like to go ahead and introduce the presenters. And you can see our pictures here. Our presenters today include Josh Agan. Josh is a partner in our Transactional and Securities Group here at Foley, who specializes in an executive compensation and employee benefits. Next picture over is mine, Kirk Creeley. I'm in the Tampa office of Foley and specialize in public company and securities matters. We also have Rich Grubaugh, who's with the proxy services firm D.F. King & Company. Many of you are familiar with D.F. King. We thank Rick for spending a few minutes with us today. Next, we also have Pat McGurn from ISS. It's always a great joy to have Pat in these programs, as he's just a font of wisdom and knows really where the market's going on a lot of these issues. And lastly, John Wolfel, who's transactional and securities, a public company attorney in our Jacksonville office. And so he'll be assisting with this presentation also. With that, I'd like to go ahead and turn to the next slide. And the next slide provides an overview of what we're hoping to cover today. We're going to be talking first about some of the voting policy changes from the proxy advisory firms, including, of course, ISS. Also be talking on the topic of proxy access and shareholder proposals and what we saw in 2016. Josh will then be providing an update on latest SEC rulemaking that affects the proxy statement issues. And lastly, we'll be covering a number of assorted items relating specifically to the 2017 proxy season. With that, I'd like to turn things over to Pat to start talking about some of the voting policy changes that we're seeing this year. So, Pat, the microphone's yours.
Thanks a lot, Kurt. And I guess the good news is there's very few changes to the 2017 season, but I did want to run through around a half dozen policy changes or full implementation of past policy that have run out of their transition periods. And I thought I'd go ahead and get started by looking back at an issue, which is overboarding. If we move on to the next slide, overboarding was a huge issue this year. We saw it come up in more than half a dozen markets around the globe. I think it's becoming more of a significant concern for institutional investors where they think that directors' dance cards are too long and too filled, I think, and so it has gotten a lot of attention. We looked at making an additional change this year with regard to non-CEO executive chairs, but after getting some feedback, we decided ultimately to engage more on that topic and revisit again for the 2018 policy cycle. I think so that means that the only significant overboarding change for the U.S. for 2017 is full implementation of the 5-seat total board limit for non-CEO directors that ISS adopted in late 2015. The transition period, which went into effect in late 2015, ends at the end of January. And so for meetings on or after February 1st of 2017, ISS will recommend voting against or withholding votes for, if there's a plurality system in place, any director who sits on more than 5 public company boards, so down from 6 as it was applied in 2016. And as noted on the slide, the policy's 3-seat total board limit for sitting CEOs remains unchanged for 2017. I think as for the impact of this change, it's uncertain right now, although we are starting to see some post-February 1st proxies showing up. I don't think we've encountered one of the 200 potential boards at Russell 3000 companies where one or more directors actually ran afoul of that 5-board maximum back in 2016. So it will be interesting to see how many of these directors have cut their dance cards down for 2017 or how many are going to plow ahead. Notably, the number one comment we got back from institutional investors was that our limit was still too high, and indeed many of them have moved to 4 or even 3 at this point in time. So just clearing the bar under our policy doesn't necessarily connotate clear sailing. Moving on to the next change, I think this had to do with IPOs, I think, and in particular dual class or multi-class voting capital structures with unequal voting rights. Just to go back in history a little time, we tweaked our benchmark voting policy back in 2014 to establish a standalone policy related to unilateral bylaw and charter amendments under our board accountability policy framework. In 2015, we amended that policy to separate the methodology for evaluating board adoption of bylaw or charter provisions made prior to or in connection with the company's initial public offering from the methodology for evaluating post-IPO changes. But to date, our policy really hadn't addressed board accountability with respect to a company's capital structure. But over the last couple of years, we received a lot of feedback from our institutional clients and also other groups like CII, I think, who questioned whether excluding capital structure from this policy provided literally an open lane for boards to limit shareholder voting rights. And indeed, there has been an HOV lane opened in recent years. We tracked nearly 80 such offerings since 2012, including nearly 20 through August of this year when we were looking at the policy. I think so. Accordingly, we've clarified our policy and aligned our approach to evaluating companies with feedback received from our institutional clients. Specifically, there's going to be a case-by-case policy that calls generally for an adverse vote recommending 4 director nominees. I think if a company completes its public offering with a multi-class capital structure in which the classes do not have identical voting rights. This case-by-case analysis will include many of the previous policy factors, including the level of impairment of shareholder rights and the disclosed rationale and shareholders' ability to both change the governance structure and to hold directors accountable through annual director elections and other things like majority voting. I think, but under the updated policy, a vote or a promise of a vote on the problematic provision by shareholders within 3 years will not be deemed sufficient protection to investors. So going forward under this policy, generally a reasonable sunset provision must be embedded into the bylaw or charter provision. And also, and notably, unless an adverse provision or problematic capital structure is reversed or removed, this policy calls for a case-by-case analysis on an ongoing basis in subsequent years. A related change, moving on to the next slide, deals with the shareholders' broader inability to amend bylaws. This change was really caused by Maryland law. The state, many of you may know, is home to nearly 80% of the publicly traded real estate investment trust, or REITs, here in the United States. And Maryland's REIT law gives very broad discretion to the board to specify in the governing documents that shareholders do not have the right to amend the bylaws. And a significant number of Maryland REITs have actually taken advantage of these provisions. We did find, when we were looking at this issue too, that other states seem to allow companies to set some barriers for shareholders to amend the bylaws as well. So it's not just limited to Maryland companies when we're looking at provisions this season. Notably, the new policy generally calls for recommendations against, or again withhold, on members of the governance committee if the company's charter imposes undue restrictions on shareholders' ability to amend the bylaws. And those restrictions include, but are not limited to, outright prohibitions on the submission of binding shareholder proposals, or things that make it more difficult, like higher ownership requirements or time-holding requirements. I think, and as with the previous policy, this policy provides for recommendations or potential recommendations against directors on an ongoing basis. I think, moving on to compensation, I think, and not a lot of revamps under our equity plan scorecard in store for 2017, but there are a couple of notes. I think for this year is, I guess overall we'd consider it to be more of a tune-up than a major overhaul, but there are 3 changes to be aware of in the U.S. The first is a new factor being included looking at dividends paid on equity awards. The second change is an adjustment to the minimum vesting restriction factor. And then finally, there's a policy clarification about bundled amendments. And I'll run through each of these 3 things very quickly. Let's focus first on the new factor, dividends. I think for the U.S. equity plan scorecard, there's only one new factor this year, and that factor is designed to look for cases where an issuer allows dividends to be paid on unvested awards. This factor will be part of the plan features pillar, and that pillar evaluates all the forward-looking plan governance features. I think accruing dividends on unvested awards is not a problem. The problem will occur when a company allows a plan participant to receive payment on a dividend before the underlying award vests. A good example, somewhat slightly disguised here from a plan that we encountered last year, showed that the issuer has an active program in place that allows this to take place. So if you've got similar language, you might think about taking a look at that. I think let's move on to the next change, I think, which is on minimum vesting. I think in this case, there are 2 key changes of the factor for the upcoming year. I think the first change is that the minimum vesting requirement must now be applied to all equity awards granted under the plan to get full credit. In previous years, you may know that we required the plan to enforce a minimum vesting restriction on all awards of only one type, let's say share appreciation awards or full value awards, in order to earn full credit under the scorecard. I think we noticed, however, that some issuers were getting credit for putting minimum vesting restrictions on an award type that they rarely, or in some cases never, granted within the last 3 years. And so we changed our approach to to make sure that all equity awards granted under the plan are being covered. I think the second change in this area, it's designed to stop giving credit to plans where the administrator has broad flexibility or discretion to override the minimum vesting restriction in the plan document. And these days, we'll pick up an occasional equity plan that contains a provision in the minimum vesting restriction that reads something like, the minimum vesting restriction shall be X unless provided for in the award agreement. In those cases, there was no certainty that the award agreement would actually enforce the minimum vesting restriction contained in the plan, and consequently for 2017, plans containing the style of language will not get full credit for having minimum vesting restrictions. And that brings us to the final change on the equity plan scorecard, the bundled amendment issue. I think in this case, this is more of a clarification than a policy change. The clarification indicates that amended plans submitted for shareholder approval, whether it's submitted for 162M purposes, tax deductibility after an IPO, or if there are shares being requested, will all receive an analysis of the plan amendment. And the ultimate ISS benchmark vote recommendation will be based on both the scorecard outcome as well as an analysis of the equity plan amendments. And then I'd be remiss if I didn't mention one additional update for 2017 on compensation, and that deals with financial performance metrics and their use in our pay-for-performance evaluation. This is a change both for the U.S. and the Canadian markets, but it's not a policy change per se. Rather, it's formalizing a piece of the qualitative pay-for-performance review that we've been doing for years. This harkens back to our survey results from over the summer, where around 80% of our investor respondents said they'd like to see more non-TSR financial metrics used in the pay-for-performance analysis, and so we wanted to formalize that process. So in 2017, we'll begin presenting a review of the relative performance metrics on 6 key financial metrics in addition to TSR. Those metrics include 3 capital productivity measures, ROIC, ROA, and ROE, plus earnings growth, cash flow growth, and revenue growth. I think pay close attention to that, because that'll be showing up in the analysis this year. It will be different from past years. Finally, and this is an odd one, we really don't see standalone proposals on director compensation very often in the U.S. marketplace, but a number of these proposals have started popping up on ballots, I think, in response to litigation in state courts over the appropriateness of director pay levels. I think to settle such lawsuits, or in some cases, companies looking to sidestep them, boards have put management proposals on their ballots seeking shareholder approval of director pay, including limits on maximum payouts. And we expect more companies to do this in 2017 as the litigation spreads. To address this new proposal genre, our 2017 policy update codifies the evaluation framework that ISS has long applied to non-employee director pay, but there are a few tweaks, notably in addition to the factors we considered in the past, central to our analysis, both on these standalone proposals looking to ratify pay and on non-employee director equity plans. We'll be looking closely at the relative magnitude of director compensation as compared to peer companies, I think, and also the previously raised issue about meaningful limits on director compensation, which are a key point in many of these lawsuits that are alleging that there's unlimited discretion to set director pay levels. So that's the roundup for 2017. Again, not a lot of big changes, but definitely some things to be aware of. Kurt, pass it back to you.
And actually, this is Josh Agan. I will do the Glass Lewis policy update next. Glass Lewis also didn't have a lot of changes. In fact, all of these were sort of clarifications or codifications of changes they'd announced earlier last year. So in 2016, Glass Lewis changed its director overboarding levels so that executive officer directors will potentially, in 2016 it was they would receive sort of a negative notation as a concern, but now in 2017 it'll actually lead to a negative vote recommendation if these limits are exceeded. So for executive officer directors, Glass Lewis will recommend votes against the individual directors if they sit on more than 2, which is down from 3 public company boards. The negative vote recommendations are generally going to apply only at the outside boards. For non-executive officer directors, Glass Lewis will recommend votes against the individual directors who sit on more than 5 public company boards, which is down from 6. The second category was governance at newly public companies. Glass Lewis generally allows for a transition period for these newly public companies to come into compliance with the stock exchange rules on governance that apply to them. but they're sort of clarifying their policy to say that if there are severe restrictions on shareholders' rights that apply indefinitely, like anti-takeover provisions, then they may not give the company that transition period, in which case they would consider recommending votes against governance committee members. The third category, board evaluation and refreshment. Glass Lewis sort of was emphasizing here, again, this is just a clarification, that it prefers a robust board evaluation process over just reliance on age or tenure limits. It believes the process should focus on aligning director skills with the company's strategy. The one other thing I wanted to mention about Glass Lewis that's not on this slide is there is you can now sign up. Issuers can now sign up for the Glass Lewis Issuer Data Report Service. The deadline for doing that is January 6th, although they may cut it off early if they get too many companies participating. But that would allow issuers to preview Glass Lewis's report that's going to be issued in connection with the annual meeting on governance. So something that if you're a public company issuer, you should definitely consider doing. With that, I will hand it over to, I believe, John Woelfel for a discussion of proxy access.
Thank you, Josh. Proxy access is the ability of shareholders to use the company's own proxy statement and card to propose their own director candidates to compete in part with management slate. Essentially, think about having more director nominees than actually board seats. This is all stemming from an SEC rule mandating proxy access that later got overturned by courts. And what you saw, not surprisingly, following that in 14, 15, and 16, and we expected in 17, is quite a few shareholder proposals asking companies to adopt proxy access bylaws. And the reality is a mainstream shareholder proposal is likely to pass if a company has no real good counterarguments and no large shareholder that opposes proxy access. Now over 40% of S&P 500 companies have now adopted proxy access. We saw over 60 companies adopt proxy access on their own volition without a shareholder proposal. So, what would you do in this situation if you were faced with a shareholder proposal and you do not have a proxy access bylaw? The easiest step is to negotiate withdrawal of the proposal in exchange for adopting proxy access, by far the easiest. Second would be to simply include the proposal in the proxy statement, recommend against it, and seek support. Third, you could use the SEC no action letter process. If you are adopting a proxy access bylaw and you seek to exclude a shareholder proposal, you can do it using the SEC no action letter process as being something that is being substantially implemented by the company. I'll caveat that with saying the no action letter relief is premised on companies having the same ownership threshold and holding period as are being proposed by the shareholder proposal. And lastly, you could also submit both the shareholder proposal and a competing management proposal for a vote. But obviously, shareholder engagement is the key. And ISS obviously will recommend and vote in favor of proxy access shareholders' proposals where a company has not previously adopted one. And what you see, which is interesting, is you see we've sort of developed a mainstream proxy access. It's 3% ownership for 3 years with the ability to nominate the greater of 2 nominees or 20% of the board, with a nominating group the size of 20 shareholders being standard. And I'll caveat that to say what we've seen with the most recent proxy no action letter trends is that if you have adopted proxy access, we're seeing shareholders propose amendments to those bylaws. And what we've seen is amendments where a shareholder wanted to increase the number of shareholder nominees to 25%, up from 20%. We saw one seeking to remove the limitation on the number of shareholders who can be aggregated to achieve the 3%. And we saw another that sought to remove any limitation on shareholder nominees based on votes and received in a prior meeting. And what's interesting about that is in those situations, the SEC does not give no action letter relief and does not take the view that the company has substantially implemented that. And also, interestingly, did not agree with companies that said that these proposals were more than one proposal since they attacked multiple aspects of the bylaw. So the reality is if you get a shareholder proposal on proxy access that has been implemented, you're likely not to get SEC no action letter relief. So what are the factors in favor of voluntarily adopting proxy access? Well, it may very well deter a shareholder proposal, especially where you fall into the mainstream proxy access bylaw being the 3%, 3 years, and with 20 shareholders being able to aggregate that ownership. You can do this typically without a shareholder vote. It's simply a bylaw amendment that boards typically can do unilaterally. It tends to, would likely probably give you a greater governance scorecard for adopting it. What are the downsides in adopting it? Well, it certainly doesn't guarantee that shareholders still won't give you submit a proposal seeking to amend what you adopted. So the reality is adopting it may not be as a defensive mechanism as we once thought. You could also wait to receive a proposal and then adopt it. I think the downside of that is you may not like what's being proposed. And otherwise, so far there's no corporate governance demerits for not having not adopted proxy access, but that may be in the future. And with that, I'd like to introduce Rich Grubauer. He's with DF King. He's going to talk about 2016 shareholder proposals. Rich?
Hi, thanks. I will talk about the main shareholder proposals, but of course, as John mentioned, proxy access was the number one shareholder proposal, so I'll start by covering some of the topics around that. What this chart shows here is the number of proposals submitted in the blue chart, and then the gold chart shows the number that actually went to a vote. So as you can see, many issuers decided to voluntarily adopt proxy access prior to allowing the proposal to go to a vote. It became an overwhelming, once the issuers kind of determined exactly where their institutional investors thought about the process through active engagement on this topic, many companies just decided it's better just to capitulate early on. Okay, so this chart shows the top proponents. As many know, that New York City started this wave through the Board Accountability Project. But like any good shareholder proposal, Chevedden, Steiner, and McRitchie now kind of usurped it and have taking charge and submitting a number of proposals this year, as well as we're seeing a number of them for next year already. Now, as you can see from this chart, it actually looks like the voting support level has dropped off a little bit, but I think that's really just a factor of the amount of proposals that went to a vote in the shareholder base, and we're now going through a larger portion of the top companies. I fully expect by the end of this proxy season coming up in 2017 that the overwhelming majority of the S&P 500 companies will have adopted proxy access, as well as New York City has stated that they intend on keeping up the campaign until all of their portfolio companies have embraced proxy access. So this is going to be a topic that I assume is going to stick around for quite a while. As John mentioned, we're seeing what we are calling fix-it proposals that are coming back and attacking companies that have one of the main features that they were jockeying for this year with the fix-it proposals, the first wave of fix-it proposals, was trying to take the 20-person aggregation cap and eliminate that. So all of the proposals that have went to a vote so far were asking from that taking it from 20 to unlimited. And these proposals all were defeated, and many of them got in the high 20s. What we've just seen is the next wave of the fix-it proposals are focusing on moving the aggregation limit from 20 to 50. So the big question will be is whether any of the institutional investors that were voting against the unlimited aggregation will be supportive of capping it at 50. Now, it's important to note that these features, the proxy access features, outside of the main features of 3.3.20, were really focused on a lot of engagement between the issuers and the major institutional investors, and they came to the 20 aggregation as a sort of something that both sides could live with. So it would be, striking if the institutional investors were willing to change that automatically. So we're anticipating that these proposals will maybe fare better than the recent fix-its, but by no means do we think that they're going to pass the way a proxy access is. One of the things I just want to hit here is that for the fix-its that did pass, those were original proxy access proposals that had adopted a 5% requirement, and that did not cut it. Okay. Next major proposal is the proposal report on political contributions and lobbying. Of course, in a political season that we're in, this is always a hot topic. This is a proposal that we saw only one pass this year, but there were 3 that got into the 40s, although the average results are only averaging at 27. So this is a proposal that requires a lot of engagement with the issuers to convince their institutional investors that they have an active oversight on all of their spending. Next proposal is the independent board chair proposal, which of course gets the most excitement in the corner office. It is, every year there's usually one company that has a proposal that becomes front page news on this. Although this year none passed, but we did see 5 of these proposals get into the 40s, so it is within dangerous striking zone. Next proposal is to reduce supermajority vote requirement. Many companies put this proposal, of course, gets significant voting support. However, these companies that get this and where it passes, what they ultimately do is the following year they put on their agenda to eliminate or to reduce their supermajority, which that proposal typically doesn't pass because it requires a supermajority. So it's sort of a circular process. Next proposal is the report on board diversity. We are seeing both diversity and tenure to becoming a main theme for 2017 proxy season. In almost many of the engagement situations where we've had with issuers communicating with their top holders, diversity and tenure has become a hot issue, and it is important to be prepared to discuss that. Now, one of these proposals passed this year, but the company did not make a vote recommendation on it. Next is majority vote for election of directors. This proposal, is probably the closest that we've seen to proxy access, where it came on strong. the overwhelming majority of the S&P 500 has majority voting, or at least a robust director resignation process already in place. It averages 70%, so you're not. There are very, very few institutional investors that will vote against it. There's a handful that will vote against it if there's a director resignation policy in place. Next proposals, there's two, both the shareholders to be able to act by written consent and for the shareholders to be able to call a special meeting. These two proposals are kind of joined together because the institutional investor community believes there should be a path to replacing directors outside of the annual meeting cycle. And it's just a matter of whether that vehicle is going to be allowing to act by written consent or to allow shareholders to call a special meeting. The proposal, right, as what you're seeing here, is to act by written consent. Not one of these proposals passed this year, but all of these companies allow, all of the companies that were targeted, the 18 that were targeted, allow for shareholders to act or to call a special meeting. So if a company doesn't allow for shareholders to call a special meeting, the written consent proposal is in jeopardy. And this is showing the proposals to call a special meeting or to reduce the percentages. So this proposal passed at 3 companies where they did not have any access to access to call a special meeting. So this is a proposal that does get traction if you do not allow your shareholders to come at the board outside of the annual meeting process. Next is the pro-rata vesting of equity awards. Although none of these proposals passed this year, we did see 4 get into the 40s, so it is something to be mindful of. And with that, I am done with shareholder proposals.
Well, great. Thanks, Rick. And I guess, Rick, I'll ask you and Pat, was there anything in this most recent proxy season regarding shareholder proposals that surprised you here, or is this pretty much everything you would have expected?
Well, this was, I'll go, Rick, I'll jump in first if that's okay. I think, again, climate change, I think, it's a hodgepodge of different types of proposals focused on climate change risk, greenhouse gas emissions, methane emissions, other issues. But if you combine them all together, it would have been right behind proxy access in the horse race to come up with the top category of shareholder proposals in 2016. And what we're hearing already this year is, given the likelihood that the incoming Trump administration will take a much dimmer view of climate change regulation and may even withdraw from the Paris Treaty, I think we're already looking at more than 200 proposals being offered on climate change and risk related to greenhouse gas emissions and the like, really targeting a very broad variety of companies. So I think we may end up at the end of 2017 with a new king of the hill as a result of people sort of switching over to private ordering on that topic instead of sort of counting on the SEC and the government to fill in the void as they had done during the Obama administration.
Mm-hmm. You were going to say, Rick?
Yeah, I would just add the only thing that's surprising is how quickly the fix-it proposals on proxy access are coming out before the majority have even adopted it. They're already coming under attack. So it is showing, for those early adopters, be careful what you ask for.
Great, thanks. Well, with that, I'll turn things over to Josh Agan, who will tell us a little bit about what's happening at the SEC when it comes to rulemaking and proxy statements. Josh?
Thanks, Kurt. So the big news is maybe that there really isn't much news this year on SEC rulemaking. There aren't any new rules that that will affect proxy statements compared to last year. There is a little bit of additional guidance on this first topic, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. But just to remind everyone, so the CEO pay ratio rules under Dodd-Frank were actually finalized back in August of 2015, and this is what's going to require disclosure of the ratio of the median compensation of all employees to the compensation of the principal executive officer. But we still have some time until these become effective. We'll first start seeing them in the 2018 proxy statements where they'll relate to 2017 compensation. But if you haven't started preparing for this disclosure, you definitely should start now because it may take some time to gear up for it. And just one other background note about this with the incoming administration, there's some speculation that some or all of the Dodd-Frank rules, could get repealed or modified. And so, that is kind of a factor in the background or a consideration in the background. But I think the conservative thing to do for now, at least with respect to this pay ratio rule, which has been finalized and isn't just proposed like a lot of the other rules, you want to at least be in a position to still comply in 2018 if the rules remain in effect. So just briefly, though, just to remind everyone, so the way this ratio disclosure is going to look is you'll have to disclose the median of the annual total compensation of all employees of the company and its subsidiaries. You'll have to disclose the annual total compensation of the CEO and then the ratio of those two numbers. So the difficulty here is in identifying the median employee. The ratio itself is going to be calculated on the basis of the summary compensation table compensation for the median employee. And that includes things like change in pension value, the grant date value of equity awards, and then sort of perquisites and other compensation. So things you wouldn't necessarily calculate for all of your workforce every year. So the rules allowed some flexibility in actually determining who that median employee is. Once you've determined who the median employee is, you have to actually calculate that summary compensation table compensation number, and that's the number you use in the ratio. But the rules were actually so flexible that they sort of they led to some uncertainty about what are reasonable methods of determining that median employee. It's worth noticing first of all that the median employee includes all employees of the consolidated company, including international employees, including union employees, full-time, part-time, seasonal, temporary workers. So it's a very broad group, and it probably captures people who might be on different payroll systems, which makes it harder to gather aggregate compensation data. So as I mentioned, the rules have some flexibility in identifying this median employee. One is you can look at your entire employee population, or you can use statistical sampling, or you can use other reasonable methods. And then furthermore, you can use sort of different compensation measures. There are a couple examples in the rules of measures that would be acceptable, but it was a pretty broadly worded. It was sort of just compensation, any compensation measure that's consistently applied to all employees included in the calculation. Question, can you use just annual cash comp? Can you use just base salary? Those questions like that have come up. And so in response to that, among other questions, the SEC issued some guidance just in October of this year that indicated, so the pay measure that you use to identify the median employee must reasonably reflect annual compensation. And so then that's, I think, getting at, can you use just base salary, for example, to identify the median employee? And I think the answer is potentially yes, if you don't have a lot of other compensation elements like commissions or bonuses that might skew the base salary number so that it doesn't really reasonably reflect annual compensation. The other disclosure interpretations covered a few other topics, like you can't rely exclusively on hourly or annual rates of pay. The time period that you use to identify the median employee, it doesn't need to be the date on which you kind of isolate all of the potential median employees, and you can even use the prior fiscal year in some cases. Furloughed employees, people are wondering, do they need to be included? It just depends on the facts and circumstances, so that the guidance wasn't particularly helpful there, but at least you have to just kind of take into consideration your individual furloughed employees to see whether they're more like real employees or more like they're just not part of your workforce for the time when they're furloughed. There's been a question about independent contractors and whether they would be picked up in the total pool of potential median employees, and this interpretation provided a little bit of help there, saying that if the issuer doesn't determine their compensation and obtains their services by contracting with an unaffiliated third party that actually is the independent contractor's employer for tax purposes, then you don't need to include them in that potential pool. Just very briefly on the other Dodd-Frank outstanding rulemaking, the SEC had proposed rules on clawbacks in 2015. There's really nothing new to report here. They still have not been finalized. They could be finalized at any time, but given the current political climate, that seems unlikely to happen in the very near term. The clawback would be triggered by a financial restatement, and it would apply to all incentive-based compensation. The one notable feature of the scope of these proposed rules was that they wouldn't pick up stock options that are granted, earned, and vest based solely on continued employment, so they aren't considered incentive-based compensation subject to the clawback policies. I'll just skip ahead to the next set of rules here, just for the sake of time. The SEC proposed rules on the mandatory pay-for-performance disclosure, and these rules, as they were proposed, would require disclosure of the relationship between the executive compensation actually paid to the executive officers and the cumulative total shareholder return of the company, and then the relationship between the company's total shareholder return and the peer group total shareholder return. And so these rules, again, nothing has happened on them since 2015, so it's sort of a little bit of wait and see. I don't know that there's a whole lot that can be done to prepare for them at this point. Before I turn things back over to Kurt, housekeeping item. So if you're seeking CLE credit for this session, please complete the polling question by entering the following code. The code is the number 8, the number 9, the letter C as in cat, the letter T as in Tom, the letter B as in boy. Again, that code is 89CTB. So please complete the polling question by entering that code. The question will remain open briefly. If you're seeking Kansas, New Jersey, or New York CLE credit, in addition to the polling question, you'll need to complete the attorney affirmation form and return it immediately after the program. A copy of that form can be found in the resource list widget. And as a reminder, certificates of attendance will be distributed to eligible participants approximately 8 weeks after today by email. Just one more time, the code is 89CTB. With that, I'll turn it back over to Kurt.
Great. Thanks, Josh. Let me get the slide back. So we'd like to end the program with just a kind of a lightning round discussion of a variety of other topics that everyone may want to consider for the upcoming proxy season. And so we'll hit these pretty quickly, but certainly happy to discuss them in more detail during the Q&A session in a little bit here. So the first topic on this list is the NASDAQ Golden Leash Disclosure Rule. On July 1, the SEC actually approved NASDAQ's proposed rule, which is 5250B3, regarding disclosure of golden leash arrangements. So a golden leash arrangement is an arrangement between a director or director nominee and a third party, i.e. someone other than the company, in which the third party agrees to compensate the director or the director nominee in connection with that person's candidacy or service as a director. And so an example of a golden leash arrangement is when an activist investor compensates its director nominee, with the compensation often being based on stock price increases. And the new NASDAQ rule that the SEC approved essentially states that these golden leash arrangements need to be disclosed either on the company's website or in the company's definitive proxy or information statement for the next shareholders meeting at which the directors are elected. And so if all NASDAQ companies should probably consider revising their form of D&O questionnaire to elicit the information that's required by this new rule. So we'd suggest something simple that you put on the D&O questionnaire, something that says like if you're a director or director nominee, are there any agreements, arrangements, or understandings between you and any other person or entity other than the company relating to compensation or other payment, including non-cash payment, in connection with your candidacy or service? So that's one thing that everyone may want to consider with their D&O questionnaires. Moving on to the next topic here, say on pay, say when on pay. Most all the say on pay votes, like prior years, have passed. It passed in 2016. In fact, according to Assembler Brosi, only 1.6% of say on pay votes failed in 2016, which represents 31 companies, and 93% passed with above 70% support. It's pretty consistent with prior years. But the other thing to consider is the say on pay frequency vote. So we've now had 6 years of say on pay stockholder voting, which means now in 2017, a lot of public companies are going to be required to include a say on pay frequency vote in their proxy statement. The SEC Rule 14821 requires a frequency vote at least every 6 years. So this means that even if a company has a say on pay vote every year and intends to continue that practice, it may still need to have a say on pay frequency vote if it hasn't had one in the past 6 years. So you may need to have both this year. So check the last time you've had a frequency vote and make sure you don't need to, or make sure you do or don't need to include it this year on the proxy statement. Jumping to the next topic, which is proxy card detail. In March of this year, the SEC issued some new guidance regarding the level of specificity and detail that needs to be included on a proxy card for shareholder proposals. Although I'll note that this same guidance also applies to management proposals. And the general principle here, which isn't new, is that the proxy card needs to clearly identify and describe the specific action on which the shareholders are being asked to vote. And in this year's guidance, the SEC, while noted, in this year's guidance, the SEC noted that it would not be appropriate on a proxy card, for example, to describe a management proposal to amend a company's charter to increase authorized shares. It wouldn't be appropriate to just simply refer to that proposal on the proxy card as a, quote, proposal to amend our articles of incorporation, unquote. You need to have more detail. Similarly, the Commission also gave some examples of shareholder proposal language that's inadequate on the proxy card. For example, a shareholder proposal that states that it's merely a proposal on executive compensation would be inadequate. You need to include the details of the proposal more in the description, and also you need to include another example that the SEC gave was, quote, a shareholder proposal on the environment, unquote, would be inadequate as well. You need to provide more details on the proposal. So companies need to keep this new guidance in mind when they put together their proxy cards, and sometimes the proxy cards are an afterthought, so they need to make sure their personnel responsible for the proxy cards are responsible and aware of this guidance. So moving on to the next topic here would be non-GAAP financial measures. And as many of you know, the SEC this year has really focused on non-GAAP financial measures. In fact, some new C&DIs came out regarding permissible and impermissible ways which non-GAAP financial measures could be used. As most of you already know, Regulation G and Item 10E already provide that when a registrant provides non-GAAP measure, it must present the most directly comparable GAAP measure with equal or greater prominence. Well, in the new C&DIs, the SEC affirmed that these requirements relating to presentation of non-GAAP information apply to proxy statements, except in one narrow circumstance, and that is if the non-GAAP measure is limited solely to the CD&A disclosure of compensation target levels, and if those compensation target levels are non-GAAP financial measures. However, the SEC clarified that if the measures are provided in the CD&A for some other purpose or provided outside of the CD&A, then this exception doesn't apply, and the regs do, which means that you need to include the GAAP financial measure, the most directly comparable GAAP financial measure with equal or greater prominence. However, the SEC did say that just in the case of proxy statements, they are okay with you cross-referencing in your proxy statement to an appendix where the most directly comparable GAAP measure is, or to the appropriate place in your 10K. So just keep that in mind that the SEC will be taking a look at CD&As and elsewhere in the proxy statement to see whether or not any non-GAAP financial information is provided and make sure there's compliance with the regs. Jumping to the next topic, which is shareholder engagement. I think most of us know on this call that shareholder engagement is becoming an increasingly hotter topic, and a growing number of companies are voluntarily adopting policies. And some companies are even creating shareholder engagement board committees. Of relevance to proxy statements, you'll probably be seeing this year more and more companies talking about shareholder engagement activities in their proxy statement. And so, if this is something that your company is considering, this may be the year to do it and the year to consider it. And I don't know if Pat or Rick, you have any comments on kind of the growing likelihood or the likelihood that there'll be a growing number of companies talking about this topic in their proxy statement?
This is Rick. I'll say yes. Right now, this is sort of the engagement season where everyone is reaching out to their institutional investors. We're seeing more and more companies including some description of their engagement process in their proxies. Now, mind you, this all kind of stems back from the original, say on pay, where the proxy advisory firms would like to see some engagement disclosure following a poor say on pay vote, and now companies even that don't have a poor say on pay vote are embracing this and including it. Mindful, please, that the institutional investors are not adding tremendous amounts of staff to accommodate this engagement, so engagement is still very difficult with the institutional investors. This is why many people are doing it now. I will say, it's harder and harder during proxy season to have engagement. However, I would like to say that if you do have an issue, a crisis, a negative say on pay recommendation, the institutional investors will provide and give companies an audience when there is that absolute need. What we're seeing now is when companies are reaching out for engagement, they're saying, many of the institutions are saying to companies, we've really had no issues, so that we really don't want to waste your time or ours. And so companies just need to be mindful of that they have a limited bandwidth and make use of that well. So, Pat?
Sure.
Yeah, just to second that, I think the bandwidth issue is becoming more and more critical these days. I think especially at some of the active managers that are undergoing cuts in staff and other things right now, given the float towards index funds and so forth. So it's a tough environment out there for a lot of the institutions, and so planning ahead and taking advantage of the off season is critical. And to the other point, Rick mentioned show your work. I think if you did engagement, I think provide some synopsis in your proxy statement, not just of the volume of the engagement and the percentage of shares that represented that you spoke to, but also the substance of some of the discussions and certainly any changes in governance practices that were made following those engagements.
Well, great. Thanks, Pat. So the last bullet I'd like to hit here is change in administration. Some of you may have heard that there's going to be a new administration in D.C. this come January. And there's a belief in some quarters, of course, that the new administration will be more friendly to the corporate community. Also, we'll be getting a new SEC commissioner at some point here. Although, we really don't know at this point whether this is going to mean anything for the 2017 proxy season. I'd be interested in hearing whether any of the presenters on this webcast want to share any prognostications, and we won't hold you to it, regarding what the new administration may mean for proxy practice and shareholder engagement and activism. So just feel free to speak out and give us your thoughts. Anyone on the call?
This is Pat. I talked about climate change proposals before, but do expect an avalanche of shareholder proposal activity this year, because I think the activist community has very low confidence levels that that the SEC is going to finalize any of these rules on things like pay ratio and other issues before the the new chair and the other new commissioners come in. I think, and so I think what we're going to see is sort of a renaissance for private ordering now, because there's no expectation of any new regulations coming out. I think also, other things, if we see first 100 days tax changes, for example, especially addressing things like a tax holiday for repatriating foreign earnings, I think this could unleash a whole wave of hedge fund activism and other contested meeting activity in the latter half of the year. So just something to pay attention to for corporate issuers going forward.
Sure. Anyone else want to offer any prognostications here?
Well, I guess I would say there's the proposed rule change of the universal ballot and proxy contest, which I think would be a major shift, and issuers would be paying the float for activists. If that could be dead in the water, if that doesn't go forward.
Great. Thanks, Rick. Well, now we're at the top of the hour, but we do have a few minutes left if anyone has any questions. And looking in the queue here, and don't see any questions lined up. But if not, we'd like to thank everyone who attended today's webcast, and certainly I'd like to thank Pat, Rick, Josh, and John for taking some time out of the day to present with us. And we certainly hope that everyone on this webcast has a happy holiday and a great new year, and hope you have a prosperous 2017. Thanks again for attending, and talk to you later.